Welcome to Editors on Editing. I'm Glenn Garland. Alan Edward Bell has edited such terrific films as The Amazing Spider-Man, Water for Elephants, 500 Days of Summer, and the last three Hunger Game films. Mark Yoshikawa has crafted such wonderful works as Tree of Life, The New World, and The Hunger Games Mockingjay Part 1. Now they have brought their editing skills to the final installment of the phenomenon Hunger Games Mockingjay Part 2. Thank you guys so much for being here today. I really appreciate it. I really enjoyed the film. Thank you.
Thanks, Rich. You're welcome.
How did both of you guys get into film editing in the first place?
I went to UC Santa Barbara, and they split up the film program into cinematographers and editors. And for some reason, there was a natural gravitation there, just being in that dark room and telling the stories rather than making the pictures. And I really latched onto it, and I loved it. I love puzzles, and I love putting together the stories. So.
And then did you cut some indies, or did you go the assistant route?
I went the assistant route, yeah. I was the small fish in the big pond for a while, and that's where I met Alan, way back in the late 90s.
Yeah, we assisted together on Bob Layton.
And what about you, Alan?
I started out as a high school dropout, so I didn't really go to college. I took my GED after 11th grade, and I climbed rocks. I was a rock climbing guide and didn't really want to be in the film business. But I was relatively bright, and so when I was about, I left high school when I was 17. By the time I was 20, I could see that, I was never going to get even moderately wealthy as a rock climbing guide. And I had a good friend named Steve Nebius, who was a assistant editor, and he was working on Rob Reiner films with Robert Layton. And after a while, I realized I need to make some money. So I looked at editing and went and visited them and saw Bob cutting and thought, wow, this looks pretty easy. I could probably do that. And I was wrong. I mean, it wasn't easy, obviously.
And how did both of you get involved in the franchise of the Hunger Games?
Well, it started with me working with Francis Lawrence on Catching Fire. And then when he signed on to do the next two films, we were both aware that we were going to have to shoot them, concurrently. So that was a lot of work to do. Plus, that meant that the first Mockingjay 1 would be a somewhat shortened post schedule because a lot of our time would be soaked up by the second movie. So Francis and I discussed hiring another editor, and he basically just said, find somebody that you like, and I'll meet him, and if I like him, then we'll hire him.
It was even nice going into the interview meeting with Alan and Francis because I'd obviously been a fan of the franchise and knew how big of a film it was, and Francis was great, and Alan was great, and so it just made that experience that much more exciting to join.
It was really fun. I mean, it's a lot of times you're forced to work with people that you're not comfortable with or people you don't know, and in this case, it really became very familial and a non-dysfunctional sense of familiarity. I mean, we really enjoyed working together.
And how were you working with Francis shooting and trying to lock Mockingjay 1 and that sort of thing?
While we were in Atlanta, Francis almost every weekend was in there at least one day.
Yeah,
because
pretty much.
Those were the days that we had because we knew we had to concentrate and get ahead of the game. So we had him in a lot on the weekends.
It was nine months of shooting, 9 months of 6 and often 7 day weeks. I had 1 2-day weekend off that wasn't a snow day.
Oh yeah.
During the entire time.
And you were saying something about when you were in Berlin, you would sometimes edit the video tap.
The hospital bombing sequence in Mockingjay 1 was supposed to be done at the beginning of the Berlin because it was all visual effects oriented, and Liam twisted his ankle. So because of that, it meant that we had to push that all the way to the end of the schedule. Everything was being processed back in LA. It meant that it would put me 2 days behind or a day and a half behind or something. So I just basically started cutting the camera taps with just AMA linking the camera taps. And in doing that, it meant that literally the day after we finished shooting, I was able to lock the sequence.
Wow.
And turn it over. I mean, I literally turned it over the day after we finished shooting.
Well, one thing that I really appreciated, it really felt like you were telling it from Katniss's perspective. Like you were really in her head, and I really felt like I identified with her because it seemed like a lot of the editorial choices, a lot of the shooting choices were all based on trying to keep in her POV.
Yeah, well, that was something that Francis, he he's really good about doing point of view stories, and very early on, even in Catching Fire, like that was sort of the mantra. If there's a question about where we should be at any given time, the answer is always Katniss. It's her point of view. Whenever you didn't, it really felt like something's not quite right here.
Yeah, in Mockingjay 1, there were a couple of scenes that we just cut it way objectively to what was happening in the other districts and the rebellion, and it just felt a little strange if Katniss didn't have knowledge of it. Then somehow, why are we even there?
Well, when they rescue Peeta, it was all sort of more from her perspective because she was only getting limited amount of information.
Right. Originally, that was the way it was scripted. Is there were all these pieces where we would cut to Snow, and Snow would be looking at her. We had Finnick, who was up top, like giving his speech, and then you had the guys. You're cutting to them going through the rescue. So there were all these reasons to cut away from Katniss, and the way we dealt with that is we realized anytime we cut away, it had to be sort of off of Katniss looking on the screen, and we never went to Snow until Snow actually came online. Sometimes, the way it plays on paper and the way it ends up on screen, you have to go through this long, lengthy process of cutting and recutting and winnowing it down to where you get this thing that's kind of efficient and plays.
Well, speaking about going from paper to the film, what was the challenges with having a series of books that have such a huge fan base and then creating the movies to satisfy that fan base?
Yeah, it was a different experience for me, especially having such, like you say, a big fan base and people that are intimately, knowledgeable about the characters and the lines and the order of scenes. And whereas as an editor, your natural tendency is to try to fix something or move things around, reorder scenes, take out lines. Francis and Nina, the producer, Nina Jacobson, were very, very loyal to the fans and the book, and knowing what was important and what people were really looking forward to. And so we knew that the favorites and the characters, but certain lines and certain scenes that people were really looking forward to were something that was new that you had to really look out for, that you wouldn't really work in as a normal editing, your process.
There's some really interesting scenes in Mockingjay 1 that almost seem to harken back to like World War II type stuff with the bunker and the bombing and the hospital.
The series is a war. It's kind of an anti-war series, so all of us wanted it to feel as visceral and as real as it could be, even though it's this fantasy world, because the whole point of the books is to basically show how power and war will corrupt the soul. Nobody leaves unscathed. So in order for that to happen, I think it really had to look and physically feel and have, callbacks to make it. It had to look like things that we have seen.
Well, even having the camera crew following Katniss throughout and trying to use that seemed very much out of modern day warfare propaganda.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's hard to, it's interesting because there are so many things that, to me, one of the things I enjoyed about working on the series is that so much of what's happening, even though it's a fantasy film, it mirrors reality in so many ways, on so many kind of subtextual levels as well. And so much of that is like, today you turn on the news and, from whose perspective is this,
Tell me about keeping these action sequences all different and varied.
I mean, so a lot of them were thought about beforehand, obviously, and pre-vised, and they were replicated sort of like the pods in the games, as far as what was happening with the oil or the lizard mutts down below or even at the end.
Well, tell me about the underground sequence, because I thought that was like tour de force. I just loved going down there. Felt like there was so much tension. I really loved the sound design. And then when the lizards came out, it was fantastic because there's complete chaos and they're in these tight places, but the geography was all very clear to me. And I thought that was really well done.
For me personally, and I think Francis and Mark will probably agree that, in action scene, geography is far more important than a lot of people think. So knowing where the antagonist is and where the protagonist is at any given point in time is very, very crucial to understanding and being on the edge of your seat. Because just cutting away to things quick and willy-nilly, why the cuts by themselves might look really cool. They don't build tension, and it doesn't make you feel like you're there. So you have to care about the characters and what they're going through. We did a scene similar in terms of where you had human beings interacting with characters that weren't there in the pond on Catching Fire. And in that case, because they were monkeys and they were significantly smaller than human beings, there wasn't a lot of interaction between the actors and the characters because they didn't exist. And Francis learned that it's just not as good. I mean, it's very hard to make it seem real if there isn't something pushing back. So
The actor isn't actually
Yeah,
acting against
so-
somebody or something.
so all of those scenes, our actors were actually, fighting real people. And that made a huge difference. It also made it somewhat hard to cut because each set of characters, they're having their fights and they're all happening simultaneously. And it was originally choreographed to happen simultaneously. And Francis likes to use multiple cameras a lot, and he also likes to make sure that he shoots everything in wide shots. And if you have something in over the shoulder, or something's happening in the foreground, and these people are fighting in the background, they're fighting in the background, but then you're going to cover them. And essentially what happens is all those fights, when we cut to each person, are actually really happening simultaneously. So,
But if you cut it simultaneously,
well, then
it's
you don't
just
get
a
to see
blur
it.
of things,
You don't
and
get to
it's-
see it, right? So you had to figure out, okay, well, when do I want to see what? And now that I've shown this, and Gail's fighting in the background, wait a minute, he already shot that lizard. Like, there was a lot of sort of like, okay, if I do this, what does that do to this? And it was challenging from that perspective because you really had to sort of pull out all the, tricks and techniques in terms of like painting out characters from the background and, changing timing of lizards and timing of performance because, they couldn't really hit each other that hard. But for the most part, it was a blast to edit. It took quite a while. And I even like did this stupid voice of the lizard guys that was it was actually pretty funny.
Hey, Mark, was it good?
Well, it was kind of
scary. It was like him with a.
It was me with a microphone, but I actually have a funny. It was like that sound, like with a record right. And I actually have a pretty funny story because I did that and I recorded all this stuff. I decided instead of flying from Paris to Berlin because we had one day off, I would take the train. So we did an overnight train, and in the middle of the night, we heard these like horrible sounds. And I was sleeping, and my wife's like, "What is that? What is that?" I'm like, "What is that noise?" And I'm like, "I don't know. It's probably somebody in the next thing." And then she goes, "No, now I hear you talk. It's you talking." And I was
It's
like,
like, it's in your
and
bag.
it was like in my bag. And apparently, the recorder that I had done the recording was in my bag, and the train jostling had caused it to play. And so it was scaring the shit out of my kid. Like, he woke up and woke her up like there's monsters in the thing. And my wife was like freaking out. I was like, "What?" And it was me making lizard sounds. But anyway, that was a pretty fun sequence. And a lot of what makes it work is Skip and Jeremy's sound design. The way that they did things with Atmos in there, they just did an amazing job.
Were
with
both
that.
films done in Atmos?
Yes, both films were done in Atmos.
And had you worked with Atmos before that?
We worked with Atmos on Catching Fire. That was my first experience with Atmos, and I think it's the best sound system out there.
Sure.
I think it is phenomenal.
And tell me about mixing in Atmos as opposed to,
It's not always about like the big scenes, that are obvious, even though when they are obvious, it's pretty phenomenal. For instance, the scene when they're going to the mansion and you have all this crossfire. And the way you sell that is with both tracers and the sounds of bullets whizzing by. Well, you hear gunfire coming from more than one direction, and all of a sudden you realize you're in the middle of it yourself as you're traveling through it. But it's also in the quiet scenes, in the different spaces,
Create the ambience
create the ambient sounds in the different areas of, of District 13, for instance. It could have just all sounded like one, air conditioner, but it didn't.
Yeah, and actually we should touch on the fact this is the first time I'd ever worked on 5.1 in the Avid, And so we were able to manipulate a lot of that right there in the Avid and right from the start, and the environments, and play with the different ambient
So you would
sound.
be putting things in the surrounds when you were cutting and things like that?
Yeah, and not just specific discrete things necessarily. It was more to feel, because we had these rooms that were big, because Alan likes, and I had the same room, the big projector screen, and
There's some depth.
yeah, some depth, so you can sit in the middle of it and really feel it, and that helped a lot in District 13 Underground, especially in that collective where they would make the speeches, and there was, Coyne was always making her speeches. It was great to have that reverb kind of playing everywhere, but having a discrete sound of her voice so you can understand and be able to split the music out and all of that.
To announce that our moment has arrived.
Tell me about working with the visual effects companies.
Visual effects take a long time, and so even when you have a luxurious schedule, it means that you're going to be turning stuff over, and Mark and I were racing to turn stuff over from the very first day.
And how do you pace things out?
Yeah, I mean, you edit it and you pace it out the way you think it is, and then when the visual effects come back, or the temp versions of the visual effects, you then take a readjustment, and sometimes you split screens and you speed up just the VFX element, or you speed up like another half of the screen to match it, or you speed up the whole shot, or you take pauses out, or blend things together. And that's something that you kind of have to do in the visual effects world, because it seems like a lot of previs and a lot of initial animations tend to be on the slow side. There's an unnatural slowness to things. Now, Charlie's very good at capturing reality, so I can't really say that is a problem we had on Mockingjay, but it has happened in some of the previs where like the action's not really realistically fast enough, or so you have to kind of constantly manipulate that and make adjustments and stuff.
Yeah, but speaking of the immediacy of those VFX, one thing, Alan has a really strong VFX background, so he does a lot of his own comping in his Avid, through Blackmagic Fusion.
And what exactly are you doing?
I do anything from what I call performance enhancing visual effects, which are, we enhance performances by editing, right? So we make cuts to, like, take two is better than take one for this line, so let's cut and use take two. Well, what if you didn't have to cut? What if you could take one and take two and hold and have them say the line and not cut away? Might look better than a cut. So I will sometimes blend performances on camera by doing full body replacements or face replacements or just eyes or just mouths. I might speed up somebody's performance by taking out pauses where in the past maybe I would have cut away, but now I'll take the time out of the middle, cut, do like a jump cut and then morph the frame, or maybe just if I know that a person's going to come in and sit down, and once they sit down, this person's going to talk, but they come in, they sit down, there's a little bit of a pause before this person talks, so I may have them come in, sit down, cut that time out.
A little bit later.
Maybe I'll use a different,
exactly.
Maybe I'll use a different take for this sit down, but I like this line better, and then blend it into the existing one so they turn their head or do whatever. So there are all sorts of different ways that I learned just by trial and error in the cutting room and doing visual effects and being able to composite. And that helps, a lot of it started as an extension of me understanding how to do visual effects and working in action scenes and blending with visual effects. And then little by little, it became something that I do relatively often in just regular performance and cutting things together. Fusion is linked to the Avid. So basically there's a plugin and it's called Connect. Let's say I'm going to replace your face. I'm going to just take line 2, 3 lines in this in the shot that I want, but line 2, I liked what you did better, and I'm going to blend it in. So I'll take, take 1 and then take 2 with line 2 down below, and the audio that I want, I have that all cut, and so now I have 2 pieces that I'm going to blend together. So I'll throw the plug-in on, and then I'll say how many layers. I'll say 2, and then I just hit export, and it exports those. And then I choose Edit Comp, and it opens up Fusion. I do my work in Fusion. I hit Render and go back to the Avid, and it's there in the Avid done. And once I render it in the Avid, anybody else connected can see and play that, and it just exists in the cut now. You can even do there's versioning, and it's relatively simple, and it's free. I mean, the connection plugin isn't, it's like $1,000 for the studio version, but Fusion itself is free. You know, you can get it and play with it and learn it.
Yeah, there'd be a lot of shots that he would come in, he would say, Mark, come in here and see if you could, because sometimes it would be the litmus test to see if I could tell
Sure,
something was wrong or if something was stood out. And very rarely I would, you know, but I came from this background of working on some of the Terrence Malick films that it was the opposite of that, where he was just trying to find everything natural and find the performances and like only just, and not try to manipulate things with the filmmaker's hand. Whereas this was the opposite of that, but a great way to help benefit the storytelling in that sense of like, because you were able to hold on a shot.
As long as it's organic.
Yeah, I mean, Francis has a tendency, and I really value this. I think it's very, it's a very effective way to shoot action, where because he's point of view oriented, you'll have a character and they'll run into an action moment, and you'll be over their shoulder, and the action happens with your main character in frame and the assailant coming this way. And so, because you're not using edits to show the action, like, you know, oh, look, and cutting away to what's happening, they run up and then cut back to this, and, you know, you're constantly cutting on all this stuff. It's all happening in one shot. You have to find ways, if you want to pace it up without cutting away, and that often means changing the time relationship between the foreground character and the background character. And once you start to manipulate things like that, you can do it, and you can do it in a way that's completely invisible. And if it's completely invisible, in my opinion, if it plays, it's totally valid.
Well, it seemed like there was a lot of things where, like, when we're on Katniss and in the background, District 2 is being attacked. And there's another one where the tower falls over at the hospital. It's all in one shot, or when she shoots the hovercraft out of the air. It's one shot. It makes it more impressive. It links it, makes it more real.
It does. It makes it feel like you're there. It feels more honest.
After the whole gate scene at the mansion and the explosion, then I felt like there was a real change of tone and pace. Was that a conscious thing that you guys were creating? It had this really cold, really foreboding feeling about it.
Yeah, it gets very quiet, and I tended to forget how much more of the film there was after that big explosion, because it's so monumental. And she wakes up again, back in her perspective in the hospital and being treated for, and you know what happened to her sister.
dreamlike.
Yeah, and everything's just still and much more static and quiet. And yeah, I'm sure that was a conscious choice by Francis, and to make it like that. And editorially, we just followed suit.
And what were you guys' greatest challenges with the cutting of the series?
You know, we did have the issue with Phil passing away, which really threw a horrible kink in the works, and it was a great tragedy. But we did have to make some changes due to that, and still try to stay true to the book.
Were those script changes or editorial changes?
A little bit of both. There was one scene at the end that was meant for him that was rewritten specifically for Hamish to read a letter that he had written. And then there were a few effects elements. We put him in the wedding, which he was meant to be there, and at the final inauguration and at the execution scene. Those were all pieces of him taken from other portions of the movie and laid in, so that, you know, I don't think the audience would know that we did that. I guess my biggest challenge was finding a way to pace my own personal physical rhythm of working on two movies that are sort of linked together, that have a way of blending into one film. And when you're doing 9 months of location away from your family, working, you know, even when your family is in town, working, you know, 6, often 7 days a week, and sometimes in conditions that are difficult. Finding a way to kind of keep a balance in my own personal life.
I definitely agree with that sentiment. I mean, I think everybody in the industry is dealing with that now, with so much production away that's hopefully coming back. But even post-production being away, it's always hard to balance. I mean, I think, I don't know if it's a challenge or it was a really opportunity. One of the biggest things for me was to join this team, because Francis and Alan worked together for 2 or 3 films before that, and Alan had his crew. And so coming into it, it was, you know, it wasn't trepidation or anything, it was excitement, but it was trying to figure out how it was going to be able to work with another editor and so closely, and especially with a director that they have. I knew that they had a shorthand already, but it turned out to be not a worry at all because Francis is great. Francis is one of the nicest men I've ever met, and especially from the top down, it was like trickle down directing. You know, he was so great. He hired a great crew. He had great people surround him, and same with Alan. So it was really a great experience overall.
Well, thank you guys very much for being here. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Glenn.
Tonight, turn your weapons to the Capitol. Turn your weapons to snow.